Good evening. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening. We're going to be looking at how data and digital tools can improve delivery on common land. So while I'm talking, Susie will put the poll up, and it would be brilliant if you could let us know a little bit about yourself so that we can see who's joining us tonight. And I will go through the agenda. So we've got a really fantastic group of speakers joining us tonight. We're going to start the evening, as we normally do, with a short policy update from Geerah Aglionby. Following that, we will be hearing from Russell Wynn, who will be talking about the New Forest Biodiversity Forum that he has been working on for some time, and how that is using data to inform decisions in the New Forest. Following that, Mark Holmes, who is one of our FCL facilitators, will be talking about the work he's been doing in the North York Moors with the North York Moors Graziers Group and sheep tracking. He'll be handing on to Ed Codling, who will be talking about both the sheep tracking project, which he's been working in partnership with Mark on, and also how collars and the data that you can harvest from collars can be used more widely for animal management. And he's going to be passing on to Owen Morgan, who is our digital tools coordinator at FCL. He'll be talking about the SFI app that we've developed and the work we're doing to build on that and look at farmer-led habitat assessment. Following that, Geerah Aglionby, our executive director, is going to be in conversation with Geerah from LandApp, talking about that relationship between the digital tool developer and an organisation like FCL. Once we've heard from our speakers, we'll be having a live Q&A. So it's really helpful if, as we go along, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask, please put them into the chat. So not into the Q&A section. You're welcome to chat within the chat section. But if you can put questions directly into the Q&A, they will be answered while the webinar is running. And some of them will be able to pull out for the live session. At the end of the webinar, I will be able to download the recording and the questions, and I'll be able to send those to you in the coming days, and they'll be up on our website as well. So here are the results from our poll. Can we see those? So we've got 40% of our attendees today are commoners, farmers. So we've got 15% common land owners, 10% land agents, 35% commoners, 15% environmental NGOs, 20% farm advisors. So a real range there across the board. So it's always good to see that we've got a variety of different people from Commons joining our webinars. So if I can hand on now to Geerah, who's going to share her slides and give us a quick update on where we are with policy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And it's lovely to be here this evening. And thank you for making the time to join us. So I'm just going to do a little bit about policy, where we are at the moment. And we'll there hasn't been a huge amount of development since our last webinar, but I think we may have some different people on this time. So I wanted to just share a few things. Is that showing all right, Lindsay?
You need to switch to the
it's different from Teams. There we go.
That's it. Perfect.
Lovely. Thank you. So, so where are we? February 2026. It's a month or so on from Oxford. Um, in terms of where we are with environmental land management, we're still awaiting details of SFI 2026. We are involved in meetings around this, and we're really pleased to be working with DEFRA on that. We've got a few meetings planned with DEFRA over the next month. Um, DEFRA are still trying to make sure they've got the best possible range of actions, and we are still flying the flag for Commons and for moorland more generally. So watch this space, but don't hold your breath, would be my advice on this. In terms of the countryside stewardship higher tier, one of our big ambitions is that people can transition from higher level stewardship to the new countryside stewardship. So we know that there are 100 commons that are in higher level stewardship. They're being rolled over. They're financially significantly disadvantaged. So that's something we're working with the Rural Payments Agency on in particular to see whether they can have the capacity that commons commons applications can be dealt with offline. And we think that's the only viable way for commons to apply because the current computer system can't cope with the size of the field parcels. Apparently the rest of the system would fall down. So that's where we want to make sure we know that it works with SFI More One. So there's no reason why it shouldn't work with countryside stewardship. What is exciting is that there are several landscape recovery schemes that have finished their development phase and their delivery plans have been submitted. And we're working with a few of those and providing some support to others. So we're really excited to see how those turn into offers. At the moment, no commons, commons have been made an offer yet within landscape recovery, but we're hoping in the next few months we'll hear a little bit more about that. There's quite a lot of negotiation back and forth. So yes. So at the moment, just to remind people, now is the time to get ready. Now is the time to make sure you're getting your consent for your fencing. So any Section 38 consents that you might need for works on commons. Now is the time to make sure that you are collecting all the necessary data. So this webinar is very opportune. Make sure you've got all your ecological data. Make sure if you're going to be doing any peatland restoration, you had your peatland surveys done, and make sure, as I said, works on commons. We know that a common that went through for getting for some fencing consent, it took 16 months for the planning inspectorate to process that. So let's use this time wisely. Another couple of bits of work that are interesting to think about are firstly the Grazing for Good project. This was initiated by the Federation of Cumbria Commoners and the Herdwick Sheep Breeders Association. It's a FIPL funded project run by the National Sheep Association, and they're particularly focusing on what is the evidence around sustainable grazing levels in order to deliver both favourable ecological condition and a future for hill farming. So the steering group is being established, which is cross-sectoral, and the Foundation for Common Land is sitting on that. And one farmer workshop's been held, and there's another one to come in March. So the independent scientific panel has ecologists, social scientists, and people very knowledgeable about moorland management. So this is around the sort of famous or infamous 0.05 livestock units per hectare and whether that is the appropriate level. And they're sort of looking at the variability within different areas of moorland. This applies really, in terms of stocking, applies to non-commons as well. And then some work around Dartmoor. So many of you will remember last time I spoke about the uplands transformation work coming out of the Hilary Cottam review, and staff are being recruited by DEFRA for the work in Dartmoor. They've already got one lead employee in place, and she's already been down to Dartmoor and will be living in Dartmoor. So that's very exciting to see that work happening. Cumbria will follow on behind, a few months on behind, probably 6 months on behind, getting Dartmoor set up initially. The other piece of information that came out just today is around the Farmer Collaboration Fund. So this was another Oxford announcement, £30 million is available there, and commons are absolutely at the heart of collaboration. So a great opportunity for commons to look at how will the Farmer Collaboration Fund work for commons. There are a whole series of events there. Not expecting you necessarily to be able to, you can't obviously click on this to book, but you do need to register to attend. So from the 11th of March through to the 14th of April, around the country, there are these different events. There's in terms of areas where there's quite a lot of common land, we've got one in Thirsk and North Yorkshire on the 19th of March, Carlisle 25th of March, 26th of March in Hexham, 31st of March in Ludlow, and 13th of April in Exeter. So all those events would be great to have those commoners and owners of common land there at that. And that's really all from me for this evening. So it's time to move on to the next part of this evening. Back to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Julia. We are going to be listening now to Russell Wynn, who has his own organisation, which is Wild New Forest. They've been involved in lots of projects in the New Forest over the last few years, and particularly the New Forest Biodiversity Forum. So over to you, Russ.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And if you can move on to the cover slide, please. So, as Lindsay mentioned, I'm based down here in the New Forest. I thought I'd give you a topical image. This is a drone picture of a grazing lawn that's been inundated in the recent rainfall, which I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. And I'm going to come back to this image later on. I'm going to talk about the New Forest Biodiversity Forum. I'm going to do three things. I'm going to explain a little bit about why we need a biodiversity forum in the New Forest. I'll say a little bit about what it is. And then I'll say a little bit about how the forum is being used to pull data through to action. In our case, our motivation is to inform conservation management for improved biodiversity outcomes in the New Forest. So next slide, please. So the New Forest is a biodiversity hotspot. It's arguably the most biodiverse part of the UK. Hopefully we're going to evidence that soon. I'll talk more about that later on. But what we are finding is, as with many areas, there are vulnerabilities in the underpinning data that we have to understand that biodiversity and make sure that management in the New Forest is targeted in the right place to maintain and maximise that biodiversity. So natural history recording, I don't know how many of you are aware, is largely volunteer-based. And the county recorders for different species like birds and mammals and fungi and things are mostly volunteers. And I think it's fair to say a lot of them are not getting any younger. They're mostly male, retired, and there are a lot of single points of failure in the system and a lot of knowledge that can disappear if the recorder disappears as well. And also there's an increased administrative burden on recorders. Here in the New Forest, for instance, if someone wants to go out onto the open forest, onto the Crown lands and do some ecological surveys for a little pet project maybe, they have to get £10 million public liability insurance and pay Forestry England a fee for a permit, which understandably deters many people and they just go elsewhere or they do it under the radar. So although in the New Forest we are responsible for about 20% of Hampshire records, and those records have recorded about 2/3 of the species ever recorded in Hampshire, as you can see in the bottom left image there, the recording is quite patchy across the forest. And it's heavily biased towards certain species groups. So we estimate we've got around 20,000 species of animal, plant and fungus in the New Forest. About 80% of those are invertebrates and fungi, but actually when you look at the number of records, they're dominated by birds and by plants, which are relatively easy for people to go out and survey. So there's a recording bias there. So we're not getting the right information across all of those important groups like fungi and invertebrates to inform management. So that's the first issue that we've got. Next slide, please. The second one is that we're not always focusing on the key problems. Globally and locally here in the New Forest, you'll be familiar with many of these big drivers of biodiversity change. So it's changes in land use, intensification of agriculture, housing, other infrastructure, climate change, pollution, non-native species, no surprises there. In the New Forest, we've retained a lot of our biodiversity because particularly the protected core, hasn't been subjected to those big changes in land use. And we've maintained a centuries-old commoning tradition where we've got large numbers of free-roaming livestock in the landscape. We're also a bit peculiar in that we're a very popular tourist destination. We have anything between 15 and 20 million day visits per year, which exerts additional pressure. But those big drivers of biodiversity change, of those, in the long term, climate change, both globally and locally here in the New Forest, is recognised as being the biggest long-term threat to the New Forest environment. And yet recreation gets a lot of headlines, and a lot of local organisations spend a majority of their time dealing with recreation, when actually there's a lot of things that we need to be doing to mitigate and manage the impacts of climate change, which are already hitting us and have been for several years now. So we need to get the evidence base around actually what are the key drivers of biodiversity change, what are the key pressures. And next slide, please. And this would all be fine if recording of biodiversity and managing and mitigating pressures was being done wonderfully by the state. But as we're all aware, funding constraints, resource constraints mean that that is not happening in many cases. And I think the issues we've had around aquatic pollution, both nationally and locally here in the New Forest, spotlight that. A lot of the public awareness around pollution has been driven by small environmental NGOs, citizen scientists like myself, and a lot of the data collection that's really showing some of those issues and providing the evidence of why we need to do something about it, again, isn't being collected by the state. It's being collected by volunteers, ENGOs and citizen scientists. So, yeah, aquatic pollution generally is recognised nationally as an issue around regulatory failure. And we just need more data now because the state doesn't have the resource and the capability to collect what we need to mitigate some of these issues. Next slide, please. So we, about 3 years ago, initiated a New Forest Biodiversity Forum. Two things we're trying to do. One is to build the capacity and the capability of our local community to generate the data and evidence that we need to meet these challenges. We've got a New Forest Biodiversity Conference, which is an annual event, an online presence, a volunteer surveyor programme, and a steering group that's drawn from a fairly broad church, and associates that we fund who are people that we want to retain and recruit in the forest because they've got particular expertise and experience. And on the other side, we're also about collecting the data and evidence and providing grants so that people can go out and do that. Where they might not be able to get other funding schemes. So these might be individuals or small groups that just need a bit of money to really catalyse some activity. We have a long-term raptor monitoring program, which is a bit of a sort of flagship, and it helps get messages out to the public. Raptors are always popular with the public. And then this year we've commissioned a New Forest Biodiversity audit. Now, I'm not going to talk much about that today because that's a big topic, but really it's about saying what's our biodiversity today in the New Forest and how can we manage the New Forest going forwards to maintain and maximise that biodiversity. And that might be a good topic for a future FCL webinar. So we're trying to generate data that improves the information available to policymakers, decision makers, and also the confidence in the decisions that they're making. The other thing that's worth saying here is that none of this is funded by the state or the big environmental NGOs. This is funded by private philanthropists. They're investing initially over the first 5 years of the programme upwards of £1 million. And the idea this is a rolling long-term program. So this is just the first phase, this five years. And the philanthropic sponsors' motivation is very simple. They live in the New Forest and they want to see the New Forest left in a better environment after they're gone than it was when they arrived here. So that's their motivation. And having that independence of the state or from the big NGOs is quite helpful because it means we have agility and we can move quite quickly around certain issues. Next slide, please. So we're not the only ones to have done this. Just a few miles to our west is the Purbeck landscape, and they've also got a natural history forum that is a couple of years older than ours, and it's been really useful learning the lessons from what they've been doing in their landscape, which again is really bringing volunteers together to support a group of major landowners to collect the data and evidence they need to manage their landscapes as good as they can for biodiversity. Next slide, please. So these are some of the things we've been doing. So every year we bring 100 representatives from all different stakeholder groups in the forest to come together at our biodiversity conference. This year's edition is coming up in about 3 weeks' time. Keynote speakers include Andrew Stringer, who's the National Strategic Lead for Nature Recovery in Forestry England, We've got Debbie Tan, who's the Chief Executive of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and we've got Rupert Brewer, who's Head of Conservation at Biston Estate, which is one of our big major landowning interests. So again, that broad range of keynote speakers just highlights that we're trying to be inclusive in what we're doing, and the forum is a touchstone each year for the community to come together, share ideas, share expertise, and I'm sure if we advertised it publicly, this is invitation only, we would easily get 200 or 300. Next slide, please. Then we're collecting evidence in the field. So the issue around pesticides, insecticides coming off of dogs from their flea treatments on their coats and getting into pristine water bodies such as those in the New Forest is an increasing national issue. So we commissioned directly Freshwater Habitats Trust, who've got the best expertise locally to do this, to go out and test what the impact is on aquatic invertebrates. So the two FHT scientists are on the right on a pretty grotty November day. And the chap on the left is Matt Rosevere, who's one of our associates, who's a talented wildlife filmmaker. He's done stuff with BBC Natural History Unit. He's there collecting material that we can then use to get nice videos and images together that communicate what we're doing to the wider public in a very visual way, and bring some of those maybe slightly dry scientific results to life for the wider community. Next slide, please. And then we have a volunteer ecological surveyor program. So the chap on the bottom right is Steve Cham, who's a national dragonfly survey expert. And he came down to teach our volunteers how to do dragonfly and damselfly surveys. And the idea is that this year, those volunteers will go out in a structured survey and collect data on how dragonflies and damselflies are faring on ponds with lots of dogs entering the water, and ponds where there isn't lots of dogs entering the water, to try and assess the impacts of this dog dipping on these key parts of aquatic life. Next slide, please. This one was, again, with our volunteer surveyors and part of our training. This was doing fungi. They're all gathered around a bit of pony poo in a bit of woodland that had lovely coprophilous dung-loving fungi coming out of it. The key thing to show here is that this group includes keen volunteer ecologists. It includes National Park Authority rangers. It includes prominent members of the commoning community. And so these people, what they learn then propagates out into their respective communities. And that learning about, for instance, why is pony dung really important in the New Forest for the ecosystem, but dog poo is bad? Why is deadwood on the forest floor really good for biodiversity? And how do we get a balance between maintaining access for commoning and other activities while maintaining that deadwood for biodiversity? So these training sessions with wide groups of stakeholders are really helpful to get some of those messages out into the community. Next slide, please. And we're using other methods of sort of soft influencing. So we work closely with local media. Here's a piece where we did BBC. I think one of my career highlights was getting nail fungus on pony dung as a headline on a BBC News piece that went out that had an accompanying TV slot on the 6 News. And it's a really nice example of helping people understand why, when we're removing conifers from the crown lands of the Forestry England do this work, we're not replacing them with trees because we're trying to restore back to the heathland that was there 50, 60 years ago before the conifers were planted on them, and helping people to understand why heathland is such an important environment and why ponies are so important in maintaining and enhancing that environment. Next slide, please. And more locally, we've just spun up a new column in the local paper, which is a rare example of a local paper that's still very widely read in the community. And again, using it as a way to get across messages about things that are interesting in the forest around biodiversity, but also being honest about some of the issues and how people can take ownership of those issues and change their behaviours to help mitigate and manage them. Next slide, please. And then this is social media, where we're highlighting some of the work that's being done, in this case, a PhD student, Gemma Stride, who's looking at monitoring the impacts of combined sewer overflow discharges into some of the most pristine rivers in lowland England, and measuring in a very scientific way as part of her PhD what harm is happening. And hopefully, as Southern Water start to invest in the infrastructure to mitigate the problem, we should start to see a biodiversity response that we would hope is going to be positive going forwards. Next slide, please. This is really to show that this is a long game. You can't go in and solve these problems in a year or a couple of years. Often when you're trying to influence policy and you're trying to influence management, it's a decadal game. So we first raised awareness of issues around curlew in the New Forest and their productivity almost a decade ago. And we're concerned that disturbance was an exacerbating factor in that because of the high levels of recreation here, particularly dog walking. We recognise that predation of eggs and chicks is the primary driver of low productivity of the population, but there's good evidence that recreation in some areas was an exacerbating factor. In the bottom right, you can see a headline there where a dog walker was spoken to by police because a curlew nest, the eggs were eaten by the dog, unfortunately, which was off the lead and out of control. So it took a decade as part of this campaign. Next slide, please, to get to a position where this was used as an evidence base to start closing certain car parks in the most sensitive areas of the New Forest during the ground nesting bird season. And this doesn't just relieve pressure on ground nesting birds like curlew and nightjar, which are key features of the New Forest protected area. But if you go to the next slide, please. Some of these areas where we're using these red signs now, which basically say don't go into these areas, we're hoping that the evidence base we're collecting around the general harm caused by, for instance, dogs going into sensitive ponds and wetland sites is going to be, again, a good reason for where at least part of the year people are strongly encouraged with this signage to choose a different route and go elsewhere. But I think it's taken us 10 years for this campaign to really reach maturity and for it to become ingrained in the local sort of public psyche. And it's going to take a few years yet to start understanding the harm of dogs going into some of these water bodies as well. Final slide, please. So I'm going to come back to this slide because it really highlights what we're all about. It's independent, which gives us agility. It means hopefully that we have the ear of the breadth of the community and that we're not viewed as being biased or trying to influence any particular sector. We're trying to be inclusive by engaging volunteers and enabling the local community to take ownership of some of the issues. We're very much evidence-led and trying to make sure that everything we do is scientifically robust, and we're taking a long-term, in some cases, decadal view about what we're doing. And this image, when I come back to it, so this shows a restored river, the Beaulieu River, the upper part of the Beaulieu River near Lyndhurst, that now overbanks. It's now connected to its floodplain because it's been restored to its previous meandering course about a decade ago. And that means that the water floods, it inundates across this grazing lawn, this acidic grassland that's part of the protected New Forest habitat, which is good because it locks water up during flood events and it reduces downstream flooding. The negative side is towards the top of the image and amongst the trees, Southern Water's wastewater treatment works that handles most of the stuff coming out of the Lyndhurst catchment can't cope during high rainfall events like many wastewater treatment works around the country. And so it discharges from a pipe into the upper Beaulieu River. And so all of that water that you see in that image will have some sort of pollutant in it. It might be sewage, it may be grey water, it may be surface runoff from roads. Either way, it is not clean New Forest water, which it should be. And so, we're increasingly concerned that livestock, common as livestock, particularly ponies, can access these waters as they recede. This pollutant might get concentrated, and then people's dogs can go and drink from that water as well. So there's a potential public health issue there. No one is monitoring this. So it wasn't really until Gemma's PhD was spun up last autumn that anyone was really paying any attention to this. The various government bodies aren't showing any concern about this. And so we've raised this issue with the wider public. And I think it's a good example of where the New Forest Biodiversity Forum, through supporting Gemma's PhD and supporting in the coming months volunteers to be going out and measuring these floodplains and the pollution on the floodplains, is an example of how hopefully that's going to pull through to increased action and mitigating some of these issues around aquatic pollution. That's it from me. Thanks for listening, and look forward to some good questions in the Q&A in due course.
Thank you so much, Russ, for that really useful introduction to the New Forest Biodiversity Forum. As an aside, I have ponies that run at Longwater, so it's very relevant to me. I'd like to introduce you now to Mark Holmes, who is our project facilitator in the North York Moors, and he's going to be sharing the sheep tracking pilot that he's been working on. Over to you, Mark.
Lindsay. Thanks, Lindsay. Yes, I guess I'm one of a bit of a double act this evening with Ed, who's going to sort of dive into a little bit of more of the academic research element of the sheep tracking pilot we've been running in the North York Moors for the last 14 months or so. My role is as Lindsay has highlighted, project facilitator, very much sort of in an engagement perspective. So I've kind of taken a bit of a bit of an angle on this of when where data meets engagement, and what sort of lay the scene a little bit about what we've been doing, and then Ed can add meat to those bones shortly. Next slide, please. So just things I guess we're going to look at over the next 10 minutes or so. I'll give you a bit of background about the project, in particular the sheep tracking pilot, which became part of the wider project. I also sort of took it from a farmer's perspective. Ian, who's one of the farmers, is on the call tonight, which is great. And I wanted to kind of share the kind of information that the farmer would get on a daily basis, and then also how this data can inform decisions moving forward. So those that aren't familiar with the North York Moors, it's a national park in the northeast corner of the country, just south of the chemistry centre that is Middlesbrough, and borders the North Sea coast. There's a large percentage of common land. On the screen in front of you, you can see all the different coloured patches. They all represent different commons. And there's a centre really of the sheep tracking trial was Glaisdale Moor, Egton High Moor, and then sort of Gothland Moor. So the lower pink, the green, and the yellow. It's as I'll expand, the project works across these areas. So initially it was a scoping project back 12 months ago, focusing on Danby and around Gothland and Egton, and Westerdale, now very much spread across the park. Next slide, please. So it's always good to go back and have a look at why things kind of started. Go back to the start and see and kind of refresh yourself of how we got to where we are. So during the pilot phase of our overall project, working in the North York Moors, looking at resilient commoning, one of the concerns that was evident was an increase in sheep thefts, and that was a real worry for some of the farmers. It was an increasing trend. The table is reported incidents of sheep thefts in North Yorkshire during 24-25. Not necessarily representative of the number of sheep that were taken at that point. So it was a worry, and that was a bit of a drive to explore what could be done in terms of tracking these and preventing these thefts. But also there was a desire to understand the movement of the sheep, where the sheep were, especially in relation to hefts or heaths or leers, I think it is in Dartmoor. So that bit of land that the sheep is familiar with, how are they interacting with that? And that could be explored through tracking. Next slide, please. So FCL, we're not a sheep tracking organisation. We're not a research organisation as such. We're interested in what else could come along alongside the sheep tracking. So very much it was a really good engagement opportunity. And it was built in as part of a wider project that was looking at building a collaborative group of farmers, of commoners who were grazing actively on the moorland, to bring them together and explore opportunities to work together, collaborate, and kind of move forward as a group. DEFRA funding was secured through the Farming and Protected Landscapes program, and it's been able to establish a pattern of work that has created and developed a group that is continuing to grow and looking towards the long term. and I guess the facilitator role and FCA's role was how we could engage more people in what we were doing, and the sheep tracking was a really good hook to get people involved. The picture on the right hand side was a kind of a workshop, a hands-on, come and see what we're doing, what it's all about, on farm with Ian, which was then followed up with a session from Perdix and the university, and ourselves about how the data could be used, but also making sure that the farmers were involved throughout the process. So it was very much getting a good understanding of their views and what they wanted and what their challenges were, as this project progressed. Next slide, please. So Ed's going to touch on this. I just want to throw this up there. There is a technical side of this as well, which Ed is much better placed than I am to discuss. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that before I go into the other stuff. So just in terms of dashboard, what are the farmers looking at? I want to kind of share this with you. So when they log on a system, they can do it through mobile phones, they can do it through laptop PCs, and they get an overview of what sheep are active, what trackers are active, and where those trackers are. So if you look at the next slide, please, Tamsin. So this is a bit of a snapshot of yesterday or the day before of to where some of these sheep were. So it gives it's updated every 8 hours, and it gives an indication of where the sheep are, which is useful for the grazier to know where they are, and a bit reassuring. But also it does throw up a few questions. So there's 1 or 2 sheep there who are maybe slightly further away than you expect them to be. That can be something that can be explored if the farmer was concerned. So what they can also see is individual sheep. So this shows the movement over the entire period of the sheep that you can see in the top left-hand corner. All the blue lines are within the heft. So there is a kind of virtual fence that has no impact on the sheep's movement at all. It's just sort of on the software, but it highlights the movement of the sheep. So it shows not only where the sheep are, but where the sheep aren't as well, which is also useful information. But one thing you can see is there were a couple of ventures of the sheep towards the road. So the road is at the sort of northern end of that photo. And Ian, the farmer, realised that it was probably salt that they were going there for, and could adapt his his work and his approach through putting salt licks up on them, or to prevent the sheep, or to make sure the sheep didn't need to venture into something that is kind of a riskier area. Next slide, please. So this is just to highlight a kind of the link and the kind of success of having this sheep tracking trial as part of something bigger. We were able to use this as a running theme through all our meetings, and update the graziers group as we go along. We've had I think we had just short of 40 graziers came to the first meeting, the hands-on meeting, looking at on farm, and at the data with the manufacturers and the university. And that communication and that engagement has continued as we've explored and developed as a group. So it's been a really positive engagement tool, as well as a really interesting study, which Ed will touch on in a minute. So one last slide, please. Always good to put the dog up. So just a few thoughts at the end, really. Sort of, if you look back to the start, it came in as very much a how do we keep track of our sheep in terms of sheep rustling and sheep thefts, but it's developed into something a lot bigger. So it's been a dynamic process as that focus has developed and shifted. It presents a real good opportunity for that wider engagement, and it's been something that we've had many conversations around with various different people, because it is an interesting thing to talk about. And that data that's been gathered, as I mentioned, Ian, and his salt licks, that can support land management. It can support animal health, and spotting sheep that aren't moving, for example, haven't moved for a while. And it just creates a little bit more resource management for the graziers themselves. And finally, we've got, as Ed's going to touch on, you might get more questions than answers, but that's been good. It's been part of the study, it's been part of the pilot, and it's been really interesting to see, okay, well, what next? Why is this interesting moving forward? So yeah, if you've got any questions for me, just put them in the Q&A bit and I will answer them as we go. But I will hand over to Ed, who is the brains behind the duo. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to give I should introduce myself first. So I'm Ed Codling. I'm a professor at the University of Essex. So I'm sort of in a background of analysis of animal movement data. So obviously this is why I've been interested in the project up on the North York Moors with FCL and Mark. So I'm going to talk about that. Probably about half of my slides will be on that particular project and just going into a bit more about the data there. But I also wanted to cover a couple of other case studies where we've been working on where we've been using different types of technology and getting different types of data, but also that will be very relevant for commons land in general. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. Next slide as well. So we've got 3 case studies. As Mark mentioned, in North York Moors, we've got 2 farmers. I think Ian was on the call. We also had Mark, who's based at Hunt House. And so we had the moor up in Glaisdale and also down towards Goathland. For reasons that will become obvious in a moment, we focused actually on the data from Glaisdale Moor. And you can see a bit more of a sort of overview, and Mark showed that earlier as well. Glaisdale Moor, it's the sort of central upland area, and it's, as Mark mentioned, we've got roads going all the way around as well, or roads or tracks, and that will actually be relevant in a couple of slides when I come to some of the data. So if we go on to the next slide. So as Mark mentioned, we were working with Perdix. They provided the sensors. So I should stress these are just GPS sensors. So all they do is track the movement of the animal. There's an update rate of every 8 hours. So we basically get 3 readings per day. And I'll show you in a moment how we can split that up sort of by evening, day, and then night. But the other sort of thing that we looked at in this study is some of the subtleties about how we actually use these sensors in terms of just simple practical things like attaching them to the sheep. So Perdix were working with the farmers, decided to glue them on using a contact adhesive. Now, for some breeds, that worked pretty well, particularly those breeds that had like the Scottish blackface that's pictured there, that had a very thick fleece. And in fact, the fleece started to grow over the sensor. It still functioned, but you couldn't really see it until they were sheared. But even then it did fall off. And you can see where Ian was actually trying to attach them to the horns actually in towards later in the study. But for other breeds, particularly the Swaledales down in Goathland with Mark, it didn't work very well at all. So I think their fleece is a bit finer and the sensor stayed attached to the wool, but the wool fell off with the weight of the sensor. So that was the first sort of highlight or low light, if you like, that there's practical difficulties potentially using this technology before we even get to the data. And so for someone like me who's interested in both the technology and the data, that's a problem to solve, but it is a problem that to sort of we had to encounter with the first bit of data. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see this is the data from near Goathland Hunt House Farm. So just a very quick overview. In the top left there, that's a plot of the space use for the whole study. So this is over a whole year, or January to November last year, for all of Mark's, I think there was 65 or 64 in his flock. And this is all the data. And then plot B, C, and D, that's broken up by, because we've got 3 readings per day, broken up early morning and day, and then evening and night. And then all the smaller plots along the bottom is basically the whole study period broken up by fortnight. And so you can see basically over the study period how they moved around. However, if you look at the bottom few plots, the last 2 rows, if you can look and sort of maybe peer a bit closer to the screen, what you'll see is there's no movement at all from any of these sheep. Now, in fact, actually what's happening is the sheep are perfectly happy moving around. What's happened is the sensors have fallen off. And they're just reporting the data from somewhere fixed on the moor. And whoever is up there, either Mark or the farmer, can hopefully go and collect those sensors, but they're not much use for animal tracking. So this was one of the first findings we had for that particular breed. Although we got a little bit of data early in the study, it wasn't really much practical use to do any further analysis. So we haven't really done much more with this particular data set. So it's something we want to go back and do this again, where we can attach the sensors a bit more robustly. So go to the next slide, please. So you can see here all the fallen sensors. Next slide. So this is now the data from Ian's farm up in the North York Moors, and again on Glaisdale. So it's the same pattern. So in the top left, A is the data points for the whole study. So Mark sort of hinted at that a bit earlier. And then B, C, and D shows the early in the morning, sorry, the day, early in later in the evening, and then earlier in the morning. So day, evening, and night, we call it. And so you can start to see patterns of movement in general during the day. They do spend more time in the central moor, and actually I'll go into a bit more detail in a moment. But also you can see with the fortnights over the study period, they do change the behaviour around. They move around on where they move around on the moor. So I'll highlight a few key points in a moment. So just go on to the next slide. It should come up. Yeah. So first of all, something to highlight. You can see this in the plot as well on B, C, and D, as well as what's highlighted there in A. There are areas of the moor where even over the whole study period they don't visit at all. We looked at the maps, we looked at the topography, trying to work out what was going on. And as far as I understand, that area where they're not visiting, it's a sort of source of a river valley, a stream going through. It's quite boggy, so it's perhaps not surprising that the sheep are going there, but it was interesting that we could pick that out almost immediately. Next slide, please. If you look at again, it's hard to see in these pictures, but maybe if you sort of look a bit closer to your screen and peer and have a look, you can see the middle bit of the moor, the higher area. In the early part of the study, so between March and May, they weren't really using that central area. And that's something that, again, perhaps was to do with the weather, that it was maybe boggier ground at that time of year. Maybe Ian can give some insight, maybe if he's here. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see as we moved on for the study, so later in the summer, sort of June and August, the flock as a whole used that central moor a lot more. So we can already start to see sort of not quite seasonal, but month by month, fortnight by fortnight, changes in the behaviour of the flock as a whole. And I will show you in a moment some individual sheep movements as well. If we go on to the next slide. The other thing that Mark mentioned as well is that if you look, I've highlighted there on the right-hand side for the 2 fortnights in April. Again, I don't know if you can see, but there's a load of data points up towards the northeast end of the moor, and that's actually a road that they're going to. So that was, we could particularly pick that out in the data that Ian identified as well, when they seemed to be going to lick salt off the road, and that was really clear in the data for the flock as a whole. The other thing to note, and I don't know if you can go back to the last slide, or whether we can. Yeah, so if you look, it seems like there's a pattern of black following actually a track across the moor. So if we go back to the next slide, the forward slide, I've got it highlighted in red there. That's Glaisdale Rig. That's not a road, it's a track across the moor. But it does seem that the sheep spending a lot of time on or near that track for whatever reason. I don't know if the grass is a bit nicer either side of it, or whether it's a bit more easier to walk across, it's not as boggy, but they're certainly using that track, or maybe it's a navigational aid, but they're using it a lot more than other parts of the moor. If we go to the next slide, please. So now this is the same sort of data, but now we've drawn it out for one individual sheep. So in these plots, it's the same thing. We've got the A is the space use over the whole study, and we've got night, day, and evening, and then the fortnights underneath. Where there's gaps for those fortnights, that's because the sensor was off the sheep then when they came down for shearing, or it was early at the start of the study or the end of the study where it wasn't being used. In these pictures, the orange in the background, that's basically the core range, the heft, if you like, of the whole flock. And the blue or purple colour is basically the movements of that individual sheep over those different time periods. So this particular sheep, there's two things I wanted to highlight. First of all, the data is pretty good. So over the months where the sensor was actually working and collecting data, we've got good quality data. So this was a particular sheep where the sensor was working well. The other thing to note is, although there's a little bit of divergence between the orange colour, where the heft for the main flock is at different times of day or over the study period, you can see that the purple colour, it tends to match with it. So this is an individual sheep that tends to go where the rest of the flock is going. And so again, we can do much more detailed analysis of the exact differences or the level of similarity. But this is a sheep which is very typical of the rest of the flock. So go on to the next slide, please. So this is another example we picked out for the two opposite reasons. First of all, this is one that's showing quite different behaviour to the rest of the flock. So you can see it's quite a lot of movement or space use over on the left of the moor. And in fact, if you look at a couple of the months, if you look at plot H and plot J, it actually went off Glaisdale Moor completely. So this was one of the sheep that was ranging and going away from the rest of the group. The other thing to note, if you look at the last three plots, P, Q, and R, where there's some data, that looks suspiciously like the sheep is not moving at all on a very small area of the moor. Now, in fact, actually, what we think is that's a sensor that's fallen off and just been producing some data with a slight GPS error. So it looks like it's moving a little bit, but it's not actually moving at all. So we've got a sheep that's behaving differently to the rest of the flock, but also we've got sensors that start to either fall off or not reporting the perfect data that we'd like. So this is, again, one of the things we have to sort of dig into in this type of data analysis. So go on to the next slide, please. So I want to also talk about, just very quickly, a couple of other case studies that we've been working on. So this is, again, another study where we've been tracking animals, sheep, up on the Commons land, but this is in Wales, near the Brecon Beacons. So this is Myddfai, a common area just on the edge of the Brecon Beacons, working with Hal Morgan, who some of you may know. Next slide, please. And what we're using here is slightly different tracking sensors. These are the no-fence sensors. You may have heard of these. So they have a GPS sensor, and we can track their movements, but also there is a real virtual fence. A real virtual fence sounds like a contradiction. This is a virtual fence where there is an electric signal, an audio signal that will, in theory, keep the sheep in an area where you have defined up on the moor. And the idea with this study was to try and see whether we could actually reheft Hal's flock of sheep, to see whether we could keep them in an area where they didn't necessarily want to be, where Hal wanted to move them to a different area of the Commons, basically to graze down some shrubby areas of land. The other thing to note from the picture here, we didn't glue the collars on. They had a net collar. So that has some advantages, possibly some disadvantages as well. But in this particular study, the collars all stayed on. And so we got pretty much 99% of the time, actually, for most individual sheep. So we've got a lot better quality data in terms of the sensors reporting all the time. But also, this is a much higher update rate. So rather than once every 8 hours, like the Northwood Moors, we're getting once every 15 minutes. So there's a lot more data to collect. Next slide, please. So what we're doing here is, as I say, we've tried to reheft them over 3 stages. So this is the first stage where the red boundary there is basically the virtual fence that we put around this group. And on the left, we've got ewes. We had 20 ewes. These are older sheep who are familiar with the moor that we were sending them to. And on the right, we've got yearlings. These are sheep that are new as adults to the moor. We want to see if there's a difference between these groups when we try to reheft them. So this first stage of the study lasted 2 months, where we're basically letting them do their normal behaviour. And you can see just by looking at the green in the middle is basically the intensity of space use, where they're going basically is where the hotspots are. And there's not a huge amount of difference. So next slide, please. And so you can see this is now the stage where we introduced a much smaller virtual fence. So we're trying to move them basically to the right and to the upper area of the Commons. Key thing to notice here is the ewes. They don't seem to be following it as well as the yearlings. The yearlings tend to stay. That hot spot of green is within that virtual fence. For the ewes, quite a few of them are going out. So they don't seem to be respecting the virtual fence as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. And the final stage of the study, we basically opened up that virtual fence again. And the key thing to take away from this slide, if you go to the next slide, actually, it should flash up with the comment, is that the yearlings seem to retain some of that knowledge about that virtual heft that we've stuck them to. So even though we opened it up, they could go back to where they were before. They stayed in this new virtual heft. Whereas the yearlings, so the ewes went back to basically their previous behaviour. So it didn't seem to work very well for them. So that was an interesting result that we weren't necessarily expecting, that it sort of worked, but it depended again on the individual sheep, their experience on the hill and so on. So this exciting potential, but there's lots of subtleties about how it might actually work in practice about rehefting and actually using this on real Commons land. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to give a quick example of also where we've been using it with cattle. So this is now not on Commons land, but on a small managed area of land, actually in Colchester in Essex. And what we're trying to do is use the virtual fencing collars that not only report position, but they also have a measure of activity. So this is how active the animal is in the area where it's going. If we go to the next slide, please. Just one thing I wanted to highlight is that the space use, the hotspots on that top map, that's where it's spending most of its time. But if you look at the hotspots on the bottom map, the darker concentration of colour, that's activity. So it shows that where they were most intensively grazing was actually not where they were spending the most time. So this for this particular study, this was an interesting finding that we weren't necessarily expecting. But again, it raises questions about management. Can you actually understand where your animal is and what it is doing at those particular locations? So there's lots of potential for this, but we've, again, need to explore that a bit further. So I think we're running out of time, but the last slide, if you move on, is just a summary. It's gone a bit funny there. So basically, we've got huge potential from this tracking technology, but as we've seen for some of the results here, it's not perfect. A lot of it depends on the application, but also practical issues like the breed of sheep, the environment that we're in, the level of data quality that you need in terms of update rate and so on. But we're hoping that this can help inform things like environmental land management schemes, by giving access to this data, we can try and refine both the way we collect it and the way we analyze it, which will hopefully be very useful moving forward in the future. So I'll leave it there. Please put questions in the chat.
Hi everyone. I thought I might get an introduction, but I'll just go straight in.
Sorry,
that's
Owen,
all
I
right.
was talking to myself on mute.
Don't worry, don't
Go
worry.
ahead.
I'll introduce myself. So, probably a lot of you know me already. I'm Owen Morgan. I'm the digital tool coordinator here at the foundation, and I'm going to give a little whistle-stop tour of some of the digital data collection tools that we have and the sort of data that we're collecting and the potential benefits of it. Next slide, please. So the main tool that you'll probably be aware of that we have here is the SFI More One app, which we developed to help people aid to do their More One collection. So I thought I'd break that down a bit and talk about how that works, but actually how that, what sort of data you get from it. So obviously one of the key elements of More One is the fact that you need to collect 1 point in every 10 hectares of your allotted moorland every year. So we, in partnership with LandApp, we're able to develop this tool that in effect, you could take your land here, you can see in this main image up on the slide here, we run a little system, run a little algorithm over the top of it that applies that 10 hectare grid and puts a random sample point in each. So that kind of takes care of that first part of the practical challenge of actually delivering that option. And the second part is then that attached to each one of those points is your survey. And you can see the little pop up there on the right hand side is what it looks like on the LandApp mobile. Now that then within it holds the data to be collected. So key collection there is you're trying to identify the sort of soil type you're on, but then there's other things around erosion, vegetative ground cover, particularly, and then there's, so back again, please, thank you. And then within that, you then get specialists, because it's an interactive survey, because it's on the app, it allows it to be interactive. Depending on what answers you give to the earlier questions, it changes the selection. So, for example, if you've identified that you're on peat, you'll then get peat-specific questions. So you'll be able to answer things around peat wetness, and then you also answer generic questions, which might be about drainage and gullies, tree cover, shrub cover, bracken cover, all that sort of thing. So the thing about More One is it's a very basic baseline survey, but what it does is allow you to collect some reasonably useful kind of baseline information. What we did then in terms of how you can use it is, if we pop onto the next slide, please, Tamsin. So this is, you know, kind of trying to make some use of that data, because you're collecting some general data, which in of itself, just on a sheet, isn't necessarily that helpful. So we looked at kind of visualizing that and making it a bit more useful. So this is an example from a site which has been, this is a common site which has done 3 years of surveying of doing More One. This is the map which is actually talking about vegetative roughness. And you can see what we're having here is actually the dark blue is in essence highlighting areas of good, you know, good roughness, good vegetative mix, delivering quite good public good in terms of potential biodiversity, water infiltration, all that sort of stuff. What you've got in here is also the light blue, which is kind of less, you know, reduced roughness, and then you've got these kind of light yellow areas, which are the areas which are quite smooth grassland, so not necessarily delivering as much public good. The advantage of this is it's visualized it, and actually in terms of land management and about thinking about, you know, potentially adaptations to land management, you've identified these pockets of areas. You can see in the kind of northwest corner is particularly an area that people might be thinking about. That might be something that the commoners are fully aware of already and understand why that's happening. But there's often these other little pockets further up into the middle of the common. Actually, people don't visit that often, they don't know about it. This mapping exercise allowed them to convert that data into just information that helps them inform future management. So that's what we're kind of trying to do with it. So More One, it's simple. You're not collecting rich data necessarily, but you're getting a broad spectrum of data. But when you put it together, especially with your 3 years worth, actually you start to get some useful little insights into potentially how you think about your moorland or your common land. Next slide, please. Now, to add on to that, what we identify is actually, by the time people, if you're doing a More One option, you're being paid to go out, collect that sort of baseline data, which is fine, as we've looked at, but actually the opportunity then is to collect some more. You know, while you're already there, it doesn't actually take necessarily, the effort is been to go and to get to the point. So we came up with this kind of farmer-led habitat assessment, which is an opportunity to collect some more useful data. And in this case, it's around identifying habitat. So you can see on the far left-hand side, that's just a drop down from the app itself, which is showing you, this is just a classic kind of upland mix that you might find. So we're looking at various types of upland heath, blanket bog, etc. What we companioned this with was an actual booklet, which was used to help identify for farmers and commoners to identify what they might be seeing. What you're seeing in the middle of there is the flow chart that's at the back of it. And you see, you work your way through that with the help of the identification images and plant images within it to pinpoint what you have. So, for example, if someone thinks they've got somewhere they've identified dry upland heath, they can select that on the app. And then what you're seeing on the right-hand side is then the additional questions that come with it. So we've put in there some conditioning assessment questions, which ask, again, they're yes/no questions around assessing some of the vegetation that they see there to get some sense of what the condition might be, so around, grazing on the heather or burning or quantity of shrub, for example. So you can do that again. So you're getting quite rich data from that. If we roll on one more slide, please. And this is the sort of output you get. So this is just an example of 1 year of habitat survey here. And you can see, yes, you're identifying where the kind of grassland is, but actually they've been able to identify, wet heathland, some blanket bog, dry heath, in quite a granular way. Comparison to maybe what some of the baseline mapping is, that's actually adding quite a lot of granular texture to the data, to being able to understand what habitats are there. And as I say, in company with that, there'll also be some concept of what condition might be like on those points as well. So again, some good additional rich kind of data that's been collected while they're out doing another action. So they've been paid to do one action, but this is a little add-on that they've been able to do. Next slide, please, Tamsin. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what we're doing at the minute. We're continuing to work on that, and we're working with the guys at LandApp to look at integrating that habitat survey into the LandApp as well, which hopefully will be coming along in the future, which would be a nice addition. 3 take-homes just from this, I think, is if you're already undertaking More One, you've signed up to More One, you're in your second, third year, whatever. If you're still doing it, think about doing something like the farmer-led habitat as an addition. At the minute we're still trialing it, so but we welcome other people getting involved and trialing it and looking at it. It's an opportunity, as we see, to get some more useful data, particularly if you're thinking about future negotiations with Natural England, you're thinking about schemes. Even if you're on private moorland, you're thinking about BNG or any of that sort of stuff. You're just getting an additional kind of baseline information you can use. If you're not currently doing More One, then look out for the new options we think might be announced in April. If there is going to be More One again or something similar, do consider it, because actually with the kind of technology that we've developed, it's actually a simple action. It's easy to do and deliver, and actually you're going to get some usable information there that can help in terms of decision making. And obviously it's a vehicle on which you can build others. We've got the habitat survey at the minute, but also thinking about additional data collection. We've got some commons where actually they're doing some soil sampling. So they're doing their one, they're doing habitat assessment while they're there, but they're also doing soil sampling at a certain number of points when they're out there again, which they're sending off and having tested. And, they're learning more about the soils, understanding more about, what's going on. The common data is power they're starting to understand what might be going on. We said we've got others who are interested in things like fire risk, so you could integrate collecting data in terms of fire load. You see, where we've got the sheep tracking work going on. There's lots of other things that could be added on. So that's really the trajectory of how we're working at FCL. We're trying to find new data sets that people might be interested in and exploring data and trying to find tools that will help you do that. Next slide, please. And yeah, so with that in mind, just get in contact. That's the email address for us, and that's the mobile that comes through to the digital team, the digital app team. So if you have any thoughts or interested in anything that we've talked about, please just get in contact. We're interested to hear your ideas and to talk to you about things you might be interested in doing. And that is me.
Magic. Thank you so much, Owen, and huge thanks to Mark and to Ed for those really thought-provoking presentations. I think we're all thinking, how do we take this and adapt it for our own commons? So now we're going to have a conversation between Julia and Dan Geerah from the LandApp, just so that you can start to understand how that relationship between Foundation for Common Land and a developer. So over to you, Julia and Dan.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and what a great session we've had this evening. I think we can probably take the slide down, if that's all right.
If we can stop sharing. Brilliant.
Excellent. Very good. Well, excellent. I think we're just getting rid of some of the spotlighting. Fantastic. Well, Dan, it's huge welcome. It's absolutely great to have you on. I know you've kindly been on one of our webinars before, and we're really pleased to have you here again. And the first question I really wanted to ask you was, the LandApp's been working with the Foundation for Common Land for the last 4 years, specifically on taking forward and building the SFI Moorland Survey tool. Why were you interested in working with us in this? How does LandApp operate, and why are you interested in partnerships?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Julia. And yeah, good to meet you all. So just quick intro. I'm Dan, one of the directors of LandApp. Been working at LandApp for the last 5 years, but Julia and I were involved in, I think, some previous Elms trials even about 7 years ago as well. So I feel like we've been very close for a long time trying to work this out together. And I guess we're always open to partnership, particularly with those that have got, I guess, specialisms in areas that perhaps we couldn't give the amount of time needed to develop. So I guess I see our relationship with the Foundation for Common Land and the wider network just as a really nice way of us demonstrating to government that if we get the right people in the room, both technology providers, but also the experts in the fields and the farmers on the ground, we can deliver a scheme at scale. And I think that's kind of what we've been proving through this. If we would have released, I guess, an FFI template general, but I think the service that Foundation for Common Land has bolted onto that meant that the value given to the farmers is far greater than us just building a tool and letting the public run with it. Having a partner like yourself that can provide the guidance, provide the customer support, having Owen there that's got a mobile phone number that the farmers can ring is a really valuable asset that I guess our small little team at LandApp wouldn't be able to offer the wider commoners.
That's great, Dan. And it seems that, we came to you, obviously, as you said, we knew each other before. And I think having these networks cross-sector is so valuable, isn't it? So we all bring different skills. It's like as though earlier Mark was saying we're not a tech company. We know the bits that we can do, but as soon as we realized that DEFRA was suggesting that farmers should fill in this horrendous spreadsheet in the field on their mobile phone, a 20 contract, I thought there's a better way. And you were the first person I rang about that. And here we are, sort of 3-4 years on, and we've got 200,000 hectares, over 400 surveyors using the SFI survey tool. Were you surprised about how much interest there was in this?
So the ask from DEFRA before the technology got involved was, it felt quite steep. But obviously, when approached by people like yourselves, I was expecting them to be successful, but perhaps not 200,000 hectares worth of success. I guess the way that we've approached the scheme, which is how do we make it as time efficient as possible to the end user, meant that the uptake's going to be a lot easier to justify from a business level. You've mentioned if the average surveyor would have to walk and fill out a form, whether that's paper-based or a spreadsheet on their phone, that was time consuming, I don't think we would have had the uptake that we see now. Whereas actually the way that it's been set up under your steer and with Owen means that it's very simple to drive a quad bike to a specific point, fill it out, and on to the next point. You don't have to spend hours and hours doing this to kind of cover the hectareage we want to, which means we've hit that level of 200,000 purely because it's very time effective now. It does pay, and it pays well because we're efficient and because the technology can support that human touch. And that human is then focusing on the value they're bringing to the system rather than it all being burdensome for the individual.
Yes, and the service we try to provide a service at 60 pence a hectare. Even on non-commons, you're getting £10.60 a hectare. So the amount of money you're spending on the tool compared to what you'd have to spend if you were doing it on paper yourself is, it makes it's cost effective, isn't it? I think that, and we're delighted to be able to then work with you on developing new tools, as Owen said about the farmer-led habitat assessment. So sort of thinking on about those next steps. People have collected this data, and many surveyors and commons associations are wondering how they can better use the data they've collected. Can you provide any pointers with how the data they've collected could be integrated with other layers of data that are available within the LandApp?
Yeah, so I think the first thing with digital data is it's very replicable. When you create a paper-based map that's pinned on your wall and you've written on pen and paper, to share that around, it takes time. You have to photocopy it or to make a copy, put it into a PDF and email it. Whereas I guess the data that's being collected through the app is a digital version that could be shared in multiple different ways. So we saw some maps earlier that show boundaries that fit in with the grazing livestock. Every surveyor that's come through the process has a clean boundary of their area of interest. And that boundary, even on its own, before you even think about the survey points, can be really valuable. That could be creating your own public footpath map that you put on a fence, or that can be running your own data layer reports to understand what designations fit in. I know Martin Steers on the call, for example, that boundary could be used for doing a wildfire risk assessment. There's lots of data that can be created on top of that just individual boundary. But then when you start thinking about, I guess, the survey points themselves, Owen's touched on this. The value, I believe the value comes into the future when we have clean baselines of which funding can try and improve that baseline, whether that's the biodiversity net gain scheme, whether that's looking through these other public or private schemes. The data that's being collected today is a really good line in the sand that has up to 3 years worth of history to it that can show progress even over that small amount of time. And so what we're really keen to do is support, I guess, Foundation for Common Land and any other user to take that data but interpret it in a slightly different way. It doesn't just have to be data for data's sake, just to tick a box for the RPA. What it's done is it's catalyzed this mass data collection across a huge area of land that could be used to justify investment. And I think that's where I'm really keen to work closely with you guys at Foundation for Common Land, is how do we help translate that into a wider language like the UK Habitat Framework that allows us to build on that and start to justify where investment, whether that is BNG, whether that's nutrient neutrality if relevant, or whether that's all these other schemes.
Yeah,
it's quite exciting. It's a big step moving from the analog to the digital world, but this is just opening up a whole new area, I believe, for what's possible in the uplands.
That's great. And every year it's getting more granular, isn't it, as people collect another point, which is very valuable. And tech is moving very fast. And when we started this survey tool, you didn't have your LandApp mobile app. The world's moved on a lot, but we built it originally on Mergin, and we're now migrating all our users across from Mergin to LandApp mobile. What benefits do you think using the LandApp mobile offers users compared to being on Mergin?
Yeah, I do remember that initial phone call. Like, I really want to be able to do this, but we don't have the tech. But
Yeah.
I know this platform called Mergin. So I guess Mergin was a really good stepping stone for us. It provided us a place to get the job done. But I guess that is the limitations to what was built. It was just there to get a job done. Whereas moving into LandApp Mobile, the reason majority of people using LandApp Mobile isn't for the SFI moorland. We've got a whole range of customers that are using the LandApp for a whole range of tasks, whether you're an ecologist or a farm advisor or a farmer or a forester. There's a lot of tools within that LandApp ecosystem that are now available to every commoner that's come through this process. So just because you've been added onto LandApp Mobile to do the foundation for the SFI moorland, you've now got access to a whole suite of other tools that is definitely worth exploring. So I would definitely encourage anyone who's here within that 3-year agreement to make the most of it, whether that's running data layer reports or building collaborative plans or exploring biodiversity net gain or looking at England woodland creation offer. There's lots of different tools that fit within that LandApp ecosystem that you're now eligible to play with. So I would definitely encourage that, play around, when you can.
I think and you have lots of webinars and trainings and lots of resources, and it, just to make it really clear to people who haven't realized, is that when you've migrated across, you're going to get a free standard subscription for the whole of the 12-month period. So it's not just those sort of 2 or 3 months when you're doing the survey. We've worked in partnership, and this is part of what collaboration is about, isn't it, Dan? That we have, we've worked out a partnership that works for the LandApp. You get, there are lots more subscribers. It works for Foundation for Common Land because people have provided a better service, and you're able to then build in and invest in your service. So we're supporting each other. And the great thing is that the commoners and the common land owners, whether you're a gamekeeper or an owner or an advisor, you then have access to LandApp, and that's really important, so the tech can grow. So just remember, anyone on this call that's been migrated across, you might find, oh, well, I don't have to use a separate platform. The great thing is you've then got that subscription. For the last couple of years, as Owen's been explaining, some of our surveyors have been collecting additional ecological habitat data. And we just had a call, didn't we, last week about how we could integrate that data with UK Hab data. Do you think that's the time when we're going to be able to do better cross-checking against remote sense data and the sort of field verification that's happening?
Yeah, so for those that aren't aware of what the UK Habitat Classification is, it's a broad categorization of all the different physical assets that you find in a landscape. So it covers the urban environment, it covers grassland, arable, right the way up into the moorlands and fens, etc. And it's the language that underpins the biodiversity net gain. And so where I see the opportunity for this project rolling into that broader picture is that a lot of those 8 or 9 categories that Owen just flashed on the screen fit perfectly into UK Hab, which will allow us to directly translate the data into that already well-established classification. But it will give additional kind of categories that you can assign every feature you see. For example, you might be walking along a track. That track could be mapped physically. You might be walking past a building. That could be mapped physically. And what UK Habitat Classification is quickly becoming is just becoming the standardized way of talking about the physical land that fits within the United Kingdom. So I see it as a really opportunity to kind of expand what can be mapped within the tool, and we already offer that through our baseline habitat assessment. But I think the bit that we are looking to learn from you guys, from Foundation for Common Land, is that that questionnaire of like yes, no, how do we guide people to get to the right code is really what I'm interested in. Is we've got a LandApp mobile where you can assign upland fens very quickly, but has that user of the app properly understood why it is that code? How can we help steer them to that code? And so that includes that decision framework. But the other fun thing that we are looking at, and this is definitely a bit further down the line, but we've kind of been floating the idea, is artificial intelligence is getting really smart now. You can take a picture of a field or of an upland flush or of a deciduous woodland, and it can return to you a confident scoring of a UK HAB code. And so obviously lots of commoners are taking photos. Just to be clear, we don't own the rights to those photos. You own your own photos, and therefore all consent will be needed if we were to use them. However, if you're interested, we really want to give the end user the ability to kind of validate their decision by taking a photo and just seeing what the AI models predict, because it's that human first approach we really want to take. But the technology is moving so quickly that would be silly not to harness it where it's possible.
No, that's very much the case. And one of the things that's been raised in the questions today, which anyway we discussed about covering it, but it's a very reasonable question from Martin, is around, at the moment you collect your data and you have it. We help people import it onto the LandApp, or they can put it into their own GIS system. I should say there are other GIS systems available. Is that DEFRA don't yet collect all this data. And I know that the data privacy is important. You've already raised this, but do you think it'd be a good idea to have all this data brought together? We're already surveying, collectively between, the surveyors, yourself, ourselves. We've got data for a quarter of all moorland in England now. I mean, it seems a waste to me that we can't look at some sort of metadata analysis across this. I don't know what you feel and whether you've been having conversations with DEFRA about this.
Yeah, in short, we absolutely have. For the last, and I can share it maybe to go out with the resources afterwards. But we have been kind of pushing a campaign called Making Land Digital, and it's kind of following in the footsteps of Making Tax Digital, where back in 2015 they released the digitization of tax returns, and it's now, as of today, the norm. And I feel like the land sector can really learn from that. And that's not to, I guess, expose private data. It doesn't happen in the tax system. It wouldn't happen in this system. But it does mean that people can stand on the shoulders of the previous people. I think the risk of today is you are surveying something that potentially someone's surveyed before. And what you'd rather see is, what was the survey from 2018? What was the survey from 2022? Because you could imagine a world where in 2030 you go to survey a plot of land and you can see somehow that metadata that you've mentioned, this was last surveyed in 2025 and it was designated X code with this condition, which means we can see that progress. And I think the other thing to say is that government do spend so much resource on administering schemes. And I am so convinced that if we can get the data in a good format, we can save costs there. And that means there's more money to go to the right people, which are the farmers and the land managers out there. So I think there's this element of cost saving that data can bring, as well as obviously standing on each other's shoulders.
Yeah, and then getting some idea of the state of the moorland nationally, isn't it? Just a collective, where are we? Because we know that the sort of priority habitat data is way out of date in terms of what's there, and so it's excellent to have this resource. Dan, I know we're running out of time. I just want to say huge thank you, and we're so pleased to continue to work with you, and we're looking forward to all these exciting ideas. And anybody who's got any additional ideas they'd like us to look at, please do get in touch. And we're pleased to hear from Paul, one of our trustees, in the chat, that he says that there's a farm payments technical test going on, so people trialing the next steps, and the more one surveys in there. So with any luck, we'll be able to ensure that farmers are at the heart of collecting data, using the data, and using the power that data gives them to deliver change, and both for their business and for the environment. So thanks a lot, Dan, for your time this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Back to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much to Julia and Dan. If I can ask all of our panelists to put their cameras on, and we can have a short Q&A. I'm sure that everyone listening tonight would agree that that was a really fascinating collection of presentations over such a broad subject area. Data is so important. We keep saying that it's important, but I think tonight, I hope that we've been able to show you how data can be collected and then how it can be used. I'd like to put a question first to the panelists. what are your thoughts on what you've heard tonight, and what will you go away with, and what will you be thinking about after the presentations that you've heard this evening? I don't know who'd like to volunteer to go first.
I can go if you want.
Thanks, Russ.
So Lindsay's kindly recently joined our New Forest Biodiversity Forum steering group, and one of the good ideas that she brought to discussion recently is around livestock tracking in the New Forest. And I think, yeah, one of the key things for me is around how do we build climate resilience? We're on the south coast of southern England. We're very much in the vanguard of feeling the effects of climate change, particularly the recent droughts that we've had. And there's a lot of wetland restoration going on in the New Forest, and anecdotal evidence that the stock, primarily ponies with some cattle, target those wetland areas because they retain good forage for longer during drought periods. But that's anecdotal, we don't know that. But that would be really important for the major landowners like Forestry England to help justify and get public support and commoners support for further wetland restoration, which at sometimes is quite contentious in the New Forest. So that's a good example of how, learning about more of this tracking work. I'm very familiar with it on birds and other taxa, but doing it on livestock is new to me. So it was really interesting hearing those case studies today, and I'm sure it'll be something I'll be discussing more with Lindsay about how we could apply that here in the New Forest to support land management. That, for me, my primary motivation is making this landscape more resilient to climate change going forwards.
Thanks, Russ. Would any of the other panelists like to add to that? Ed?
I think that sets me up nicely to respond, actually. Thanks, Russ. I was actually reflecting some of the comments in the Q&A around obviously this a lot of this technology is still developing. You can buy it off the shelf. So the no fence collars I was using are off the shelf, but they're very expensive. It was only because I had a research grant from the university that I was able to do that. But I think there's a sort of, if you look at the value of what we could do in the past with this new technology, so farmers know where their animals go. Yes, they probably do, but we don't necessarily have the evidence base for all the animals all the time, and we can get that from these sensors. So exactly the example you mentioned, Russ, where we're looking at, are they going to these particular habitats? Or there was a question in the chat as well, what did the farmers learn by doing this? Well, they didn't necessarily know that a few of the sheep were going really, really, really far, like tens of kilometers away, I think, for one of them, that were away from the heft, which was not anticipated. So I think there's those interesting bits of learning that we can get from the data. But then I think looking at the way environmental land management is going, we're going to need evidence, and I think that evidential sort of support that we're going to be able to get from this data, whether it's the tracking data or whether it's the LandApp type data, I think it's going to be absolutely crucial. Not just for the research projects, but for the overall the management of it. And I think, that's where I'm going to reflecting on the value of the evidence that we can potentially get. And the other thing, of course, is that a lot of this is in development. So we try to use them in different ways in the North York Moors, and it didn't work in some cases. So, I think we have to be aware of how we come around and overcome some of those problems. And the first step of that is identifying what those problems are. And I think we've started to do that in the North York Moors.
Thanks, Ed. Mark, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just kind of echo the 2 points that Russ and Ed have made, really. I think information is key, and the more information that as grazers, commoners, the wider community have about the practice, about the environment they're operating in, the better informed we are to have those discussions with the powers that be. And I think there'll be more and more discussions happening. And as things develop and SFIs come, maybe in the spring, summer, we don't know. We hope. But I think that it's evidence. It's being able to say, this is what happens, this is the proof, and this is what we need. So I think that all the presentations we've had tonight and the discussions, I think, lend themselves really well to that. And I think it's just absorbing that information, going away, thinking, okay, how can we apply this in different scenarios? So thanks to everyone for their time on the panel.
I think Lindsay let Dan.
I was just going to say that one thing that I was taken up by most of your presentation is just how data is presented. I think I'm taking away, like, we want farmers or commoners or the public to care about the information we're finding, I think, is being as we've got to be as clear as possible about presenting it. Like, it's very visual, the way the sheep's grazing, and you can tell a story very well. And the same with the the New Forest, having a narrative around what you're trying to show is really important. So I think that's something that we constantly need to keep working on together, is how do we want to present this data in a meaningful way that means it's actionable. And like you're saying, Ed, everyone is still on this development journey. I feel like no one's here with a fixed final product, and so all the feedback we can get from anyone which would help you make your decisions or persuade someone to do the right thing, we really want to hear that, because data's good, but it's only as good as it's how it's presented.
Julia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've taken away is the layering. There are so many aspects to this, and we've just brought together, we've brought together sort of 3-4 topics today. But I know, say, a common that I work with, where I took a group of students last week in the Buttermere Fells, and they've been doing the farmer-led habitat assessment, with support from Owen and other organisations, and they're really keen on the sheep tracking as well, because now they've got this data around habitat. They're now interested in where the sheep are, because then they can layer this on. So what we're finding is that once people get interested in data, they're more interested in data because they can see the benefit of this. So that people get quite hungry quite quickly for getting involved in these projects, and that's incredibly exciting. And then it works, all that feeds into their next scheme, whether they're going to go for perhaps landscape recovery, or they're going for a CS higher tier. Delivery of SSSI favourable condition, I mentioned in the policy update around the grazing for good. If we want independent scientific advice, we need to very regularly see how we can collect that data. And at the moment, Natural England cannot afford to collect the data regularly for SSSIs. And a lot of the uplands, half the uplands is SSSIs. So in terms of government reaching government targets as well, this is hugely valuable. And the New Forest is obviously a SSSI as well. So, we've got a whole range of interested people coming together, and it's just superbly exciting. But it's how we get the tech to catch up and be credible enough to do it scale, isn't it? That's one of the things we're still working on. But it's a bit like people working on AI, isn't it? We have to keep going, and we'll get there.
That's fantastic. Owen, did you want to add anything to that?
I think really to mirror what was Julia saying, and I think that was my strongest take home from everything, is that there's an intersection between all the pieces of work that we've seen today, and actually when that starts to become most powerful when we can start to layer them up with one another, when we can start seeing what the livestock are doing, what vegetation we have, what conditions we have, where the flood risk is, in comparison to vegetative roughness. You know what I mean? All of that is, because that's the thing. We all know, probably on this call, that commons and uplands, are complicated spaces which deliver a lot of public good, but the evidence base for that has always been poor. This is part of this building, showing that they are these complex kind of ecosystems of systems that are happening. And actually, when you can start to evidence that, you start to show the real value of our common land. As I said, we're very much on that journey. We're not there yet, are we? But you feel like there's pieces of the jigsaw on this call tonight.
Thanks so much, Owen, and a huge thanks to all of our panelists this evening, and to those of you that have joined us and given us your time to listen. We have answered all of the questions that you put into the Q&A through the Q&A. I will share all those answers with you by email, and we've got a poll here just coming up. It would be really useful to understand how useful this webinar was to you. Please, if you have any further questions or any other subjects that you'd like us to cover in our webinars, do send me an email. I get several emails after every webinar, and it's really interesting to receive your feedback. So do please do that. I'm delighted to say that it's going up. 85% of you felt that tonight's webinar was very useful. So I would agree with that completely. It's been a brilliant webinar. And if you've got any colleagues, fellow commoners who would like to see this webinar, please tell them it was great, and we will share that further, the details of that further. So it will be available on our website. And we have a couple of little extras I'd like to remind you of. We have our next webinar next month will be looking at millennia. Our Bracken webinar was hugely popular. I'm guessing the millennia webinar will be the same. Adrian Colston will be joining us, and several commoners on Dartmoor who are doing some millennia trials. So that will be really interesting. We have just a few places available on our Common Land Masterclass on the 10th of March, which is a whole morning. Julia talked earlier today about the Section 38 consent. It is so important to understand the rules and regulations around commons if you want to deliver really good schemes. So that masterclass is a really fantastic way of finding out what you need to know, what you don't know about commons. So yeah, get in touch with me if you've got any colleagues or you would like to join that masterclass. We do bespoke masterclasses for groups of up to 12 people as well. So yeah, thank you so much once again. If Tamsin, you could share our final slide. It's got all of our email addresses on there. Have a very good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We can all talk now.